February 19th, 1952. A cramped cafe on Königsallee, Düsseldorf. The smell of strong coffee and cigarette smoke hung thick in the air as two men in threadbare suits leaned across a corner table. One slid a folded sheet of paper beneath a sugar bowl. The other palmed it without looking, nodded once, and left. To the waitress clearing dishes nearby, it was nothing, just businessmen exchanging notes. She couldn't have known she'd just witnessed a moment in the quiet resurrection of the Third Reich. This is the story of how Nazi Germany tried to rise again, not with tanks or torches, not with marching columns or midnight rallies, but with something far more insidious: index cards, address books, and patient men willing to wait. While the world celebrated Hitler's defeat, former officers of his regime were already planning their return to power. They called it a circle. British intelligence called it a conspiracy. History would call it the Naumann Circle, the closest thing to a Fourth Reich that ever existed. Werner Naumann had been a ghost for 5 years. In April 1945, as Berlin burned and the Reich collapsed into ash, he'd been one of Hitler's chosen. The Führer's last testament named him state secretary to Joseph Goebbels in the propaganda ministry, Goebbels' designated successor. When both Hitler and Goebbels committed suicide in that bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Naumann inherited leadership of a ministry that no longer existed in a government that had ceased to be. He disappeared into the chaos of Germany's final collapse, another face in the flood of refugees and displaced persons streaming through the rubble. By 1950, he'd resurfaced in Düsseldorf with a new identity: respectable businessman, managing director of an import-export company, modest apartment in a city still patching its gutted facades with grey plaster. Outwardly, Werner Naumann had joined the millions of ordinary Germans trying to rebuild ordinary lives. Children played amid rubble piles in the streets. Coal smoke drifted from cast-iron stoves in apartments that still lacked central heating. The scent of cabbage stew filled narrow stairwells. Naumann blended perfectly into this landscape of quiet survival. But in his cramped office and his modest flat, he was building something extraordinary: a network. His personal address book reportedly contained over 700 names. He maintained correspondence with as many as 1,000 contacts spread across Europe and South America, former officers, party officials, propagandists who'd scattered to Spain, Argentina, and Egypt. Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite commando, was on the list. So were propaganda specialists in Buenos Aires and economic advisors who'd found haven in Franco's Spain. Naumann's network stretched from the Rhine to the Rio de la Plata, but the heart of his operation beat in West Germany itself. Beginning in February 1952, Naumann convened monthly meetings with 6 core associates. They used false addresses, personal couriers, code names. Members traveled under forged papers, coordinating contacts across Lower Saxony and North Rhine-Westphalia, movement facilitated by sympathetic clerks in local registries who looked the other way. The gatherings rotated locations, a basement here, a private office there. The soundscape at these meetings was always the same: hoarse voices behind closed windows, the scratch of fountain pen ink on index cards, the occasional tram bell from the street below. Every noise was a potential risk. What were they planning? The answer was chilling in its bureaucratic precision. The Naumann Circle's explicit aim, as captured later in intelligence files, was to place a few hundred trusted men into veterans' associations, farmers' groups, small business organizations, and local administrations. Not as leaders, not yet. As secretaries, registry assistants, membership coordinators, the low-salary municipal posts that controlled roles and meeting agendas. Positions with low visibility but high gatekeeping power over memberships and votes. This wasn't revolution, it was infiltration. One seized notebook contained a marginal note that would haunt historians: "We must be patient, one secretary, one mayoral clerk at a time." Another document outlined an explicit timetable. Phase 1, embed in associations, 1951 to 1952. Phase 2, entry into party structures, 1952 to 1953. Phase 3, public leadership. When conditions permit, they expected slow, incremental gains over 3 to 5 years, rather than an immediate coup. They were betting on post-war amnesia and legal openings, and they'd identified their vehicle, the Free Democratic Party. The FDP was perfect for their purposes: centrist, electorally viable, and already hosting many former Nazis in its ranks. Academic studies would later reveal exceptionally high proportions of former Nazi Party members inside early 1950s FDP state delegations, over 20% in some regional parliaments. Naumann's Circle called it entryism: place your men, control the membership lists, shape the candidate selections. Wait for your moment. Before we go further, where are you watching this from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if this story is as chilling to you as it was to discover, hit that like button and subscribe. You won't believe where this goes next. The strategy gained urgency in October 1952 when Germany's Federal Constitutional Court banned the Socialist Reich Party, an openly neo-Nazi organization that had won seats in several state parliaments. The message was clear: overt Nazi parties would be crushed, so Naumann shifted emphasis entirely to covert infiltration of mainstream parties. If they couldn't march in uniform, they'd wear business suits. Rural areas became the focus. Naumann's planners believed control of local cooperatives and guilds would translate to grassroots electoral muscle. Daytime meetings in small-town cafes, where men compared veteran association rosters and exchanged folded lists beneath sugar bowls. Charity evenings for veterans, modest cultural events. Quiet ways to recruit and vet loyalists without arousing suspicion. They mapped local vote turnout calendars and scheduled social events the week before municipal ballots. Small manipulations designed to shift narrow outcomes in rural districts. The texture of their conspiracy was mundane: carbon-copied letters with thumbprints, cigarette burns on correspondence, coffee ring stains, thin yellowed index cards hand-pinned in private offices. An administrative spider's web, rather than a headline-making militia. Police files would later describe simple ledger pages with initials and numeric codes that looked like innocuous bookkeeping but actually mapped contacts across regions. Personal diaries recovered in searches showed members writing about rebuilding honor and placing old comrades back into civic life. Euphemisms rather than overt ideology. Naumann's correspondence repeatedly warned about press leaks. One paraphrased line in security files reads, "Secrecy first, no paper trail." But secrecy has limits. Across the Channel, British intelligence was watching. Sir Yvonne Kirkpatrick, the British High Commissioner, had authorized surveillance months earlier. Wiretaps were in place, transcripts were accumulating. Agents tracked unmarked cars through Düsseldorf and Hamburg. And in the winter of 1952-53, as coal shortages gripped North Rhine-Westphalia and political club meetings became attractive places to trade favors and information, the British files grew thicker. One wiretap transcript captured members joking about attending a theatre premiere to meet suitable men, an almost bantering reference to human recruitment at social events. Another intercepted conversation discussed coordinated infiltration efforts across 3 states. The evidence was building toward a single, inescapable conclusion. The Fourth Reich wasn't coming with armies. It was already here, in the registry offices, in the veterans' halls, in the association secretaries' desks, and time was running out to stop it. The listening device ticked behind the plaster. Room 317, a nondescript apartment building in Hamburg, winter 1952. British intelligence officers sat in a converted lorry 2 blocks away, headphones pressed tight, pencils scratching transcripts as voices filtered through static. They'd been monitoring Werner Naumann's network for 8 months. What they were hearing terrified them. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was a blueprint for takeover. The Cold War had created a moral labyrinth in occupied Germany. American and British intelligence agencies desperately needed information about Soviet movements. Former Wehrmacht officers knew the terrain, former Abwehr agents knew Soviet tactics. The calculation was ugly but pragmatic. Useful Nazis could be tolerated, even protected, if they helped against communism. This blurred line between expedience and principle created grey zones where men like Naumann could operate. British monitors tracked his movements through a web of informants and technical surveillance. Unmarked vehicles followed him from his Düsseldorf office to discreet meetings in suburban homes. Agents photographed visitors. License plates were logged. Telephone lines were tapped. The operation was massive, coordinated, and conducted with extreme secrecy. The British couldn't risk alerting German authorities who might have sympathizers embedded in their own ranks. What the surveillance revealed was staggering in its scope and sophistication. Naumann's correspondence network functioned like a clandestine corporation. Letters moved through coded post boxes. Radio addresses used initials H17, RO, to mask identities. A cache of intercepted letters showed members reporting on local political situations, identifying vulnerable party branches, and recommending candidates for placement. One letter discussed a vacant secretary position in a Bavarian farmers' cooperative. Another outlined a strategy for getting our man elected to a Veterans Association board in Lower Saxony. Each communication was brief, bureaucratic, and devastatingly methodical. The meetings themselves followed strict operational security. Members arrived separately, never in groups. They parked cars blocks away, False names were standard. One detained associate later testified that he'd knocked on 3 different doors, using 3 different code phrases before being admitted to a gathering. Inside, the atmosphere was businesslike. No Hitler salutes, no overt Nazi symbolism, just men reviewing lists, discussing placements, and coordinating strategy with the efficiency of corporate managers planning a regional expansion. British transcripts captured the ordinariness of evil, discussions about which local newspaper editors were sympathetic, which clergy might be useful, which small business owners had party connections. Members spoke in careful euphemisms, national renewal, traditional values, German interests, but the intent was unmistakable. One wiretap recorded a participant saying, "The FDP in North Rhine-Westphalia is ripe. We have 3 district secretaries and 2 regional committee members already, 6 more placements, and we control candidate selection." Patience was their weapon. The texture of evidence accumulated in British files painted a portrait of systematic subversion, microfilmed letters, travel tickets showing patterns of regional coordination, thumb-printed carbon copies, physical surveillance photographs showing the same faces appearing at different locations weeks apart. Intelligence analysts created massive wall charts tracking connections, lines drawn between names, locations, dates. The spider's web became visible, but catching them wasn't enough. Sir Yvonne Kirkpatrick, the British High Commissioner, faced a diplomatic minefield. West Germany was technically sovereign under the occupation statute, but Allied powers retained security prerogatives. Acting against German citizens without Bonn's approval risked a diplomatic crisis. Acting with Bonn's approval risked leaks. The German government itself might be compromised. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's coalition included the FDP, the very party Naumann was infiltrating. The Cold War context made everything more complicated. Some American intelligence officers argued that aggressive anti-communist Germans, even former Nazis, were assets against the Soviet threat. Why dismantle a network that hated communism? British intelligence took a harder line. A neo-Nazi network was a threat, regardless of its anti-Soviet credentials. Democracy couldn't be defended by rehabilitating its enemies. Through autumn 1952, British monitors documented escalating activity. The Socialist Reich Party's October banning had pushed Naumann's timeline forward. Intercepted conversations showed urgency, references to the window closing, discussions about going public sooner than planned. One transcript from late November captured a chilling exchange. "If we wait 5 years, we'll have the apparatus, but if circumstances force our hand in 2 years, we can still capture enough positions to influence outcomes." The sound of these men planning was mundane. Coughs, chair scrapes, the rustle of paper. One witness would later describe hearing the tick of hidden listening devices behind wall panels, a paranoia that shaped behavior. Members spoke in lowered voices even in supposedly secure locations. They checked windows before speaking. They wrote notes and immediately burned them in ashtrays, which made British collection of physical evidence difficult. Rural recruitment accelerated. Ex-Wehrmacht veterans' halls served double duty as social centers and recruitment nodes. Banquets and shooting club evenings became fertile ground for placement conversations. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Host an event honoring fallen soldiers. Identify men with influence in their communities. Cultivate them over beer and shared memories, then quietly suggest they join this or that association where they could help rebuild German dignity. Consumer scarcity made this easier. Many ex-officials lived in cramped 2-room flats with plaster dust on windowsills and patched curtains hung to stop drafts. Housing shortages meant ambition had few outlets, a promise of purpose, a network of old comrades, and the prospect of political influence. These were powerful lures in a society still sorting collaborators from victims. British analysts noticed patterns in the recruitment targets. Factory foremen who supervised dozens of workers, small-town mayors who controlled municipal jobs, newspaper distributors who could influence which stories got prominent placement, teachers who shaped young minds, postal clerks who could intercept letters, registry officials who controlled identity documents. Each placement multiplied influence. Ordinary citizens remained mostly oblivious. People were occupied with survival, industrial shifts, coal mining schedules, overtime in butcheries. Few had bandwidth to spot subtle political penetration. A new face at the Veterans Association? Someone's nephew getting hired as assistant to the agricultural cooperative director? It seemed like ordinary post-war networking. Small favors, jobs for the boys. Nothing sinister, unless you saw the pattern. And by January 1953, British intelligence had seen enough. Kirkpatrick authorized action. The intercepts indicated coordinated infiltration efforts across multiple states. The window for intervention was closing. if Naumann's network embedded deeper into the FDP structure, removing them without destabilizing the entire party and possibly the governing coalition would become impossible. The operation was planned for the night of January 14th to 15th, 1953. Simultaneous arrests in Düsseldorf and Hamburg, 7 targets. Surprise was essential. German police weren't informed until hours before the raids. Even then, only select officers were briefed. British security forces assembled in the cold darkness. Their vehicles moved through streets still scarred by war, past gutted buildings and patched facades, past windows where families huddled around coal stoves. The smell of smoke and damp plaster hung in the winter air. What happened next would shock 2 nations and expose just how close the Fourth Reich had come to reality. The knock came at 2:17 in the morning. Werner Naumann opened his apartment door in Düsseldorf to find British security officers with arrest warrants and German police standing behind them. No guns drawn, no shouting, just cold efficiency in the January darkness. Across the city, in Hamburg, at addresses in Essen and Dortmund, 6 other doors opened to the same scene. The Naumann circle had been shattered in a single coordinated strike. What British forces found inside would document the anatomy of a conspiracy. Naumann's apartment was modest. 2 rooms, a small kitchen, furnishings that suggested a man of limited means. But his desk told a different story. Stacks of correspondence organized by region, index cards with names, party affiliations, and coded notations, a massive address book with over 700 entries, lists of veterans associations, farmers' cooperatives, small business guilds, each organization marked with symbols indicating penetration level. 1 for contact established, 2 for member placed, 3 for controlled. The physical evidence was overwhelming. British officers photographed everything before seizure. Travel tickets showing patterns of movement across North Rhine-Westphalia and Lower Saxony, carbon-copied letters with instructions for placement strategies, microfilmed correspondence with contacts in Spain and Argentina, the administrative apparatus of a shadow government preserved in yellowed paper, and cigarette-stained index cards. 1 notebook contained meeting minutes spanning 11 months, attendance lists, discussion topics, action items. The banality was chilling. These read like corporate board minutes, not conspiracy records. Motion carried to prioritize FDP district committees in rural constituencies. Agreed to establish monthly coordination meetings for regional secretaries. Budget discussion, funds allocated for travel and event sponsorship. The Third Reich reconstituted as a non-profit organization. In Hamburg, officers arrested Dr. Gustav Scheel, former Nazi student leader and rector of Strasbourg University under occupation. In Essen, they took Werner Naumann's top lieutenants, men who'd held significant positions in the propaganda ministry and SS administration. Each arrest yielded more documents, more lists, more evidence of coordinated infiltration. The smell of damp paper, cheap tobacco, and boiled coffee permeated the seized materials. Some documents bore coffee ring stains. Others had cigarette burns along the margins where anxious members had held them while reading. These mundane traces, the archaeology of conspiracy, became crucial in court papers. Dawn broke over a stunned Germany. British authorities immediately handed monitored telephone transcripts, surveillance photographs, and seized documents to the press. The headlines exploded. Neo-Nazi network uncovered. Fourth Reich plot exposed. British arrest 7 in midnight raids. International coverage was immediate and damning. The New York Times ran it above the fold. Le Monde devoted 3 pages to analysis. Even newspapers in Latin America covered the story, worrying that émigré Nazi networks in Argentina and Brazil might face similar crackdowns. Public reaction polarized instantly. Conservative German newspapers worried about political destabilization and questioned British jurisdiction. How dare occupying powers arrest German citizens without German authorization? Was this democracy or continued occupation? The sovereignty wound was still raw. Germany had only regained partial independence in 1949. Left-leaning journals took the opposite view. They'd been warning about Nazi resurgence for years. Der Spiegel published lists of former Nazi party members in FDP delegations. Die Zeit ran investigative pieces on how denazification had failed. The Fourth Reich was already here, became a common headline. Anti-fascist activists organized protests demanding thorough investigation of all political parties. The diplomatic fallout was immediate and complex. Chancellor Adenauer faced a crisis. His coalition included the FDP, the very party Naumann had infiltrated. Adenauer had to condemn the conspiracy without destabilizing his government. He walked a rhetorical tightrope, praising British vigilance while asserting German sovereignty and promising German authorities would handle prosecution. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. British forces handed the arrested men to West German authorities on April 1, 1953. Naumann and his associates entered pre-trial detention. German prosecutors reviewed the evidence. The case seemed airtight. Documented conspiracy, clear intent, hundreds of witnesses who could testify about infiltration attempts. Anti-fascist activists expected significant prison sentences. Then, on July 28, 1953, a Karlsruhe court made a decision that shocked the nation. Werner Naumann was released from detention. No trial, no conviction, released. The legal reasoning was technical. Under post-war denazification categories, Naumann had been classified in August 1953 as a Category 2 offender, a follower with significant responsibility. This designation still allowed many civil activities. His conspiracy, prosecutors argued, hadn't actually violated specific criminal statutes. Infiltrating political parties wasn't illegal, writing letters wasn't illegal, attending meetings wasn't illegal. The conspiracy was disturbing, but not, strictly speaking, prosecutable under existing law. The anti-fascist movement erupted in fury. Protest demonstrations filled city squares. Justice for whom? Demanded placards. The perception, accurate or not, was that the German legal system was protecting its own, that judges who'd served under the Nazis were reluctant to prosecute men with similar backgrounds, that the cancer of Nazism remained embedded in German institutions. Naumann briefly attempted to capitalize on notoriety. In August 1953, just weeks after release, he declared candidacy for the Deutsche Reichspartei, a far-right party that wasn't quite illegal but was widely viewed as neo-Nazi. It was a spectacular miscalculation. Public outrage was immediate. His attempt to convert clandestine networks into open electoral power met withering condemnation. Even conservative papers that had questioned British jurisdiction condemned Naumann's brazenness. He withdrew his candidacy within days. The damage to his network, though, wasn't total. This is what haunted intelligence analysts. The arrests had decapitated leadership and exposed the conspiracy, but hundreds of placement targets had been achieved. The men embedded in veterans associations, farmers' cooperatives, municipal offices, they remained in place. The index cards listing sympathetic newspaper editors, cooperative clerks, registry officials, those cards were copied before seizure. Some members were never identified. Intelligence reports described the group's technique in political subversion as combining personal patronage, placement of loyal administrators, and exploitation of post-war social dislocation. These techniques survived exposure. The micro-tactics, control of membership rolls, rumor propagation, strategic placement in low-visibility positions became lessons for future extremist organizers. Would you have recognized the threat? Imagine you're a post-war German citizen in 1952. A new member joins your Veterans Association. Polite, organized, volunteers to handle membership lists. He suggests hosting charity events. He recommends candidates for association leadership. Nothing seems dangerous, just a helpful volunteer. How would you know you were watching infiltration in real time? The Naumann affair illustrated something terrifying about democratic fragility. Emerging West German democracy in 1952 felt precarious. Legal bans on extremist parties, intelligence actions crossing sovereignty lines, internal party shifts sorting collaborators from Democrats. The machinery of democracy was still under construction, and enemies were already testing its seams. Witnesses interviewed decades later described the paranoia of that period, being followed by unmarked British vehicles, hearing mysterious clicks on telephone lines, the tick of listening devices behind walls. Small anxieties that shaped behavior made people cautious about whom they trusted, what they said aloud. But here's the question that should haunt us. The Naumann Circle was caught because British intelligence had resources, legal authority, and political will to act. What about the networks that weren't caught? The men who learned from Naumann's mistakes? The tactics that survived in quiet places, waiting for their moment? The Fourth Reich didn't die in those January arrests. It evolved. Werner Naumann died in his sleep on October 25, 1982, in Ludenscheid, West Germany. He was 69 years old. The obituaries were brief. Former businessman, wartime government official, his death barely registered in a nation that had moved on. But in the 4 decades between his arrest and his death, the shadow he'd cast never quite disappeared. The lesson of the Naumann Circle wasn't that democracy defeated extremism, it was that extremism learned patience. After his aborted political comeback in 1953, Naumann retreated into obscurity. He returned to his import-export business, maintained a low profile, gave no interviews, attended no rallies, But his address book remained active. Letters continued flowing to contacts across Europe and South America. The network had been exposed, not destroyed. It simply went deeper underground. The Free Democratic Party, shaken by the exposure, conducted internal investigations. Some former Nazi members were quietly removed from leadership positions. Others remained, their expertise deemed necessary, their influence too embedded to extract without fracturing the party. This compromise haunted West German politics for decades. Studies in the 1960s and 70s would reveal that significant proportions of civil servants, judges, and local officials in the early Federal Republic had Nazi Party backgrounds. The denazification process, rushed and incomplete, had left rot in the foundations. But something unexpected happened in Germany through the 1950s and 60s: prosperity. The economic miracle transformed the country. Factories rebuilt, cities rose from rubble, living standards soared. Democracy delivered what Nazism had promised but never achieved: actual prosperity, actual security, actual dignity. The generation that had followed Hitler into catastrophe watched their children grow up in peace and plenty. The material success of democratic capitalism became the most powerful argument against extremism. Yet the techniques Naumann pioneered didn't vanish. Intelligence services across Europe documented their reappearance in different contexts. The strategy of entryism, infiltrating mainstream parties rather than forming fringe movements, the focus on administrative positions over public leadership, the patient accumulation of influence through networks rather than manifestos. These tactics survived. In Italy, neo-fascist groups in the 1970s used similar methods. In France, far-right movements in the 1980s adopted comparable strategies. The playbook was adaptable. Identify vulnerable institutions, place sympathetic people in gatekeeping positions, wait for crisis moments when public frustration creates openings. Naumann hadn't invented these tactics, but his network had refined and documented them with Prussian efficiency. The personnel files and index cards seized in January 1953 eventually made their way to historical archives. Researchers accessing them decades later were struck by how modern the conspiracy felt. The organizational charts could have come from a corporate restructuring plan. The placement strategies resembled modern political campaign targeting. The communication security protocols anticipated later terrorist cell structures. Evil had been bureaucratized with terrifying effectiveness. What protected West Germany wasn't just vigilance, it was investment. The Marshall Plan poured resources into reconstruction. NATO provided security. The European coal and steel community, precursor to the EU, bound former enemies in economic interdependence. Democracy was defended not just by arresting conspirators, but by making democratic society worth defending. People don't embrace extremism when they have jobs, homes, and hope. But that raises an uncomfortable question. What happens when prosperity falters? When economic security erodes? When people lose faith in institutions? The conditions that made 1950s Germany vulnerable to infiltration weren't unique. They're recurring features of disrupted societies: economic dislocation, housing insecurity, political polarization, cynicism toward elites. These are the cracks extremism exploits. The Naumann Circle's true legacy isn't what it achieved, it's what it revealed about democratic vulnerability. Open societies offer freedoms that can be weaponized against themselves. Free speech protects extremist organizing. Free association allows network building. Electoral politics can be infiltrated. Administrative bureaucracies can be captured. Democracy's greatest strengths create its greatest weaknesses. How do you defend an open society without closing it? This paradox consumed German political debate for decades. Too much security apparatus recreates authoritarian control. Too little allows extremism to grow. The Constitutional Court's 1952 ban of the Socialist Reich Party established precedent for defensive democracy, the principle that democracies could restrict freedoms to protect themselves. But where's the line between defending democracy and betraying it? Modern parallels are uncomfortable. Contemporary extremist movements have studied these histories. The playbook hasn't changed fundamentally. Control information flows, capture administrative choke points, exploit economic anxiety, wait patiently for crisis moments. The technology differs. Social media replaces index cards. Encrypted messaging replaces coded letters. But the strategy remains: bore from within, wait for your moment. The men who sat in those smoke-filled rooms counting membership lists understood something essential about power. Revolutions are dramatic but fragile. Infiltration is slow but durable. Coups seize the palace but leave the country hostile. Networks capture institutions and make control invisible. The Fourth Reich failed, not because the strategy was wrong, but because it was exposed too early. What haunts historians studying the Naumann affair is how close it came. Another year of patient placement, another dozen municipal secretaries, another election cycle to activate networks. The tipping point might have been reachable. At what threshold does infiltration become irreversible? When does a Democratic Party become an extremist vehicle wearing democratic clothes? Werner Naumann spent his final decades as an ordinary businessman in a prosperous democracy. His neighbors probably didn't know his history, his colleagues likely never discussed his past. He attended church, paid taxes, and lived quietly. The man who'd planned the Fourth Reich died in comfortable obscurity, his conspiracy a footnote in history books. But the techniques live on. In every society where extremism stirs, you'll find echoes of Naumann's methods. Patient men making lists, quiet infiltration of associations and institutions, the accumulation of administrative power while avoiding public spotlight, the exploitation of democratic freedoms to undermine democracy itself. These are patterns, not anomalies. The real question isn't whether such conspiracies can happen, it's whether we'll recognize them when they do. Because the next Naumann circle won't announce itself. It won't wear uniforms or march openly. It will look like civic engagement. It will sound like legitimate political organizing. It will feel like ordinary networking until the day you realize the Veterans Association, the Farmers Cooperative, the Municipal Registry, all have the same quiet men in key positions, and they're all waiting for the same signal. Democracy survived the Naumann circle because British intelligence was watching, because officials acted decisively, and because post-war prosperity made extremism less appealing than reconstruction. But surveillance has limits. Official action risks overreach, and prosperity isn't permanent. The price of democracy is eternal vigilance, not just against armies and coups, but against the patient enemies who understand that real power comes not from seizing the palace, but from quietly controlling who gets the keys. Werner Naumann's address book is in an archive now, 700 names, carefully recorded. Most of those men died decades ago, but somewhere, in some disrupted society facing economic anxiety and political polarization, someone is making a new list and waiting. The question is, will we notice before it's too late?